Ebtesam Al-Ketbi, Chuan, Paul Steinberg, and your panel moderator, Gillian Tett.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next session of today's conference entitled Global Threats to the Global City. I said yesterday in the opening comments that we at the Financial Times love stories, and cities are at the center of many of the stories that we like to write about today. There are good news stories of the sort that you've just heard about in relation to cultural rejuvenation and cultural collisions. But what we're going to be talking about now are the bad news stories, or mostly the bad news stories. In particular, the multiplicity of threats that are building in our cities. And this is a big issue because, as you've also heard, just over half of the world's population now live in cities. Over the next 3 decades, we could see that proportion rise even higher to about 2/3 of the world's population. And yet at the same time, for most people, it seems as if the potential threats in those cities are rising. So we have a tremendous group of people to talk about these threats and ways to deal with them today. On my far left, your far right, we have David Kilcullen, who's president and CEO previously of Caris Associates, now with New America Foundation. He's worked for many years in the security world. He was previously an advisor to General Petraeus in Iraq. He's also written a book about ISIS and spent a lot of time looking at the terrorism threats. So he can give us a good perception, a good perspective on just how worried we should be about terrorism. Next to him, we have Dr. Ebtesam Al-Ketbi, who's president of the Emirates Policy Center, who's got a great viewpoint of what's happening in the Middle East and the security risks there. She's been an academic looking at this for many years. Next to her, we have Dr. Tan Chuan, who is president of the National University of Singapore, an expert on pandemics and the threats that those pose. And on my immediate left, your right, we have Paul Steinberg, who's Chief Technology Officer of Motorola Solutions, who's been looking a lot at these cyber threats. So we have a really nasty cocktail of risks represented on the platform. And I suspect that by the end of this, we may have concluded that we all want to go and live in a cave in New Zealand. Or maybe not. But before we start off talking about what are the biggest risks and what can we do about it, and should we be heading for that cave, I want to quickly ask you lot about how you feel about the risk today. I'm going to ask you a simple question about whether you think that cities today are safer than they were 10 years ago or not. And then I'm going to ask you whether global cities are safer than they were 100 years or not. So all of you who think that global cities today, major global cities like Chicago, New York, Hong Kong, Bangkok, if you think they're safer than they were 10 years ago, raise your hands. Okay. And you think they're more dangerous? Okay, we have quite an evenly split audience here. How about 100 years ago? Safer? Sorry, I should say safer than 100 years ago? Okay, in fact, a majority of you. More dangerous than 100 years ago? Okay, well, that is actually encouraging. So we don't need to head for that cave on that basis. The vast majority of you think that they are more safe than they were 100 years ago, and about half of you think that they're safer than 10 years ago. That's particularly encouraging given that we're sitting in Chicago, which over the weekend had a series of press stories about the appalling and tragic rise in the murder rate in Chicago. So the fact that most of you don't appear to be panic-stricken about safety is encouraging. David, is it justified? Looking at terrorism, looking at things like the tragic events in Paris and Brussels, do you think cities today are safer from terrorist threats?
If we take it what I would call an all-hazards approach, right, so we think about all the possible things that can harm you, I think it's undeniable that we are significantly safer now than we were 10 or most definitely 100 years ago. On the specific subset of terrorism, we're actually significantly more at risk, and that's because of the way that terrorism has evolved since 9/11, and that's driven by two things. One is the massive expansion in electronic connectivity that's happened in just the last 10 years or so, and the other is the fact that we're now dealing with not one, but two global terrorist organizations with transnational reach.
But tell us about how terrorism has evolved, because I've always had a very different perspective from my American friends on this, in that I grew up in London in an era of IRA bombs. And when I was a teenager going into London to go and meet my friends, it was just there as part of the fabric. I wouldn't say it was like the weather, but it was just always there as a consciousness, a part of your consciousness. So how exactly has terrorism changed today for people sitting in the room right now?
I think there are four key ways that I'd point to. One is the emergence of what I would call guerrilla terrorism. So if you think about 9/11, it was sort of expeditionary terrorism. You know, you form the team in country A, you infiltrate them into country B, you carry out your attack. Now we see much more locally grown groups where instead of trying to smuggle a team into the target country, you're growing the team close to the target. So the London 2005 bombing is a good example of that. It's also a good example of what we might call the inside-outside threat, where the threat comes from within the country, but outside the city, right? So Paris is another good example of that. The Paris attacks were not planned inside Paris. They're planned in other cities in Western Europe. Second one is urban siege, right? So we're starting to see terrorism that attacks the city itself as a target. So the Mumbai attacks are an example of that. Paris is another. To some extent, some of the attacks we've seen in Africa, like the Nairobi attack in 2013. So the city itself, the communication systems, the stock market, the banking system, the infrastructure, rather than individuals within the city. The third one is what we in the business call leaderless resistance or leaderless jihad, where now instead of having a structured organization like your example of the IRA, where as an intelligence professional, you can identify the plot, you can see it developing ahead of time, and then you can interdict it. Now it's much more ad hoc, much more spur of the moment. Mohamed Merah, who did a number of killings in Paris and across France in 2008, in his last conversation with police interrogators before he died, they said to him, "How long were you planning the attack?" And he said, "No, I just woke up this morning and decided to do it." So it's almost impossible.
Predictive policing,
much harder to
terrorism.
predict. Yeah. And the final one is this remote radicalization. You know, the connectivity explosion means that somebody like Ammar al-Awlaki in Yemen can reach into a military base in the United States via email and Twitter and the internet and radicalize somebody remotely. Now that works both ways, right? But so there's a lot of evolution in the threat picture, I think.
Right. So a common thread of that is electronic communication.
Absolutely.
And the way that that's changed the nature of our world. It's basically connected us, the world is flat, as Thomas Friedman once said, connected us very powerfully and in many ways made us very vulnerable. I'm curious though, Paul, I mean, you work in the communications business. Mm-hmm. How concerned are you that technology is actually making the threats worse?
It's a great question. I think of technology, I mean, really as a technology officer, there aren't really too many problems I don't think can be solved by technology. But by the same token, obviously, there's a double-edged sword there. So kind of the way I think about that, you know, building on David's point, the world has never been more connected. 3.4 billion smartphones in the world now. The mobile data growth, year-on-year growth was 60% from April of last year to this year. 1.65 billion active Facebook users, so a lot of information out there. And there's a saying that 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years. And that was true last year and the year before that as well. So a lot of stuff out there. Our dependence on it is growing dramatically. And so I kind of got a hard lesson on this. My younger daughter was in high school a couple of years ago, and she sent me a text. I was traveling and said, "Dad, the school's in a hard lockdown." I said, "Holy cow, that's never happened before. That's a bad day." And so I sent her a text back, and I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "I don't know. I'm in the English room. We don't have any windows. We're not allowed to talk. Out of line of sight at the door, everything, you know, things like that." And so I sent her back a text and said, "Are the police there?" And you could almost hear the duh come back. I said, "I don't know, Dad. I don't have any windows, can't see anything." So
okay, anyone who's got a teenage daughter like I do knows this kind of conversation very well. It's kind of duh with a kind of emoticon you can't actually figure out, but yes.
So I kind of reeled it back in again, and we started going back and forth. Eventually she said, "Okay, the police are here, and okay, they're in the building and everything's fine." So then I started to think, I was like, how did she know that? I mean, she's at a mushroom in a dark room. And so when she came back, when I talked to her that night, and she said, and you might have guessed it, well, my friend Angie was up in the science room with a window, and she was taking pictures with her iPhone and posting it on Facebook. And my other friend was overlooking the foyer doing the same thing. So two things struck me about that. So power of technology, that's what they did. That's what they expect. These kids, you know, teenagers were severely threatened and scared, and that's just how they reacted, very naturally. Second thing was all that information they had would have been really useful to the people outside the building trying to help them. And right now, that loop isn't closed. Flip it around though, why am I worried? There is so much enablement out there. There's the saying that the slowest rate of change we'll ever experience in our lifetime is today. And it will just continue to escalate. So think about how cheap and accessible technology is. Drones is a good example. You can't go too far without reading about drones. 1.9 million sold this year alone, expected to be 4.3 million by 2020. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to think of things you could do with drones that are not particularly healthy for society. And then the final piece is cybersecurity, which is kind of where you started this. 25% year-on-year increase in data breaches. So our dependence on technology.
25% increase, year-on-year increase in data breaches.
Yep, Q1 of 2015 to Q1 of 2016.
Right. So what worries you most about the cybersecurity issue with cities today? Is it the thought that they can get into the electricity grid or the banking system? Is it the thought they can go and jam, our Uber cars, good heavens forbid, or something like that? I mean, because I was very struck. I was actually talking to some intelligence people late last year about what happened in Ukraine, where it's been rather partly covered up, but essentially there was the first ever recorded, it seems, cyber breach of a Ukrainian power plant, which sent a very ominous signal about what people can do these days.
Yeah, so industrial control systems, which is what you're alluding to, Gillian, those are probably some of the ripest targets where a lot of intersection of terrorism or ill intent can actually wreak a lot of havoc. So that's certainly something we have to be very, very careful of. But increasingly, it's predicted, and we've all seen the predictions. I'll use one: 25 billion devices on the Internet of Things growth by 2019. So increasingly, our dependence on these connected devices that are hackable and can be misled or coerced to provide false information. So my worry is the connectivity and the accessibility of all the technology and our rapid growth and dependence upon it.
Right. I'm going to come and talk to Dr. Al-Ketbi and Dr. Tan in a moment. Before I do, though, have you seen any evidence that ISIS is yet tech savvy enough to go and attack an electricity grid in America or a nuclear power station or do any of the really nightmare things? Because it seems to me you've got these Russian hackers sitting around in a basement somewhere doing things to banking systems. But thus far, we haven't seen the nightmare scenario of ISIS or the terrorist groups actually getting cyber capabilities yet. Or am I being a bit naive here?
There's certainly, no. I mean, you're right. We haven't seen that happen in a Western city yet. We have certainly seen, for example, in the city of Sirte in Libya, ISIS now controls the entire data system of the old Libyan banking system, which gives them access to SWIFT, for example.
Wow.
So there's a lot of things that are potentially able to develop. But I get back to something Paul said about convergence, right? During the Mumbai attacks in 2008, people did exactly what your daughter did, right? They went to an area called the Chambers in one of the hotels and began tweeting and posting on Facebook to say where they were. In Karachi, the Pakistani terrorist group running the attack had a safe house. They spotted this activity on Twitter, tweeted back to their guys in the building and sent them down to the Chambers area to target the people that were hiding there. So it works both ways, and you can actually see people that want to help you, but also people that want to harm you, tapping into that same degree of connectivity. And I think when you bring in SCADA systems and smart cities and industrial controllers, now you're in an environment where, let's imagine everybody's driving around in cars that have satellite systems. There's been a physical demonstration of the ability to hack a vehicle in transit, take over the steering and crash it. You can also simultaneously turn every traffic light green in an entire city at rush hour. So there's the ability to have remember what I said at the beginning about the city itself is the target. You can start to have really significant effect on that.
Right.
And I think it's only a matter of time before we start to see that come from Islamic groups. But I would just suggest that we overestimate or we overemphasize the role of Islamist terrorism in the overall terrorism picture. There are a lot of other terrorism groups that are not linked to specific religious ideology that are quite active in that field as well.
Like what? I'm going to ask Al-Ketbi to talk about this in a minute, but what are the other terrorist groups we should be watching? We were talking earlier in the green room, and you said that, for example, there are more attacks each year in America right now from far-right American groups.
Well, domestic terrorist groups, yeah. So not necessarily sort of neo-Nazi groups, but domestic terrorism is actually, by numbers of attacks, significantly more, numbers of plots and numbers of attacks, significantly more common than the kind of jihadist terrorism that we've been talking about. Similarly, you've got a variety of anti-globalization and far left groups as well that are engaging in activity like this. And a lot of us are worried about the environment that's developing in Europe, where you have far-right groups, populist backlash against immigrants. You've got somewhere between 400 and 600 ISIS operatives that have been inserted into Europe in the refugee stream, and you're creating all the pieces in a very industrialized and urbanized environment for fairly significant unrest going forward.
Right. I mean, Dr. Al-Ketbi, when you look at the perspective from a Middle East perspective, not from a Western European or American perspective, what worries you most right now about the security threats in cities?
Well, the type of threats has been changed. I mean, when you ask, was the cities more safe or not, the type of threats has been changed. And I believe when only focusing on the terrorist group and marginalize other type of threats, this is it's not a healthy condition, because still WMD, okay, it's a threat for biological, chemical weapons. It's also very, very dangerous, and how this transfer from cities to another. Now, of course, in the Middle East perspective, when you look to, maybe you will not find that like organized crimes, like especially in the West, but there are roots of threats, like when you see poverty can be turned to terrorism. Most of those joined ISIS, it's because of they have no hope, no future. It's not only because ideological, and also they are having psychological problem. Maybe ISIS is, when you view it, it's the great terrorism now phenomena, but it's not less than Al-Qaeda before. It's not less than what has been mentioned about the terrorists, the local terrorist group, what they are doing. Yes, what they are doing to heritage, what they are doing now in Iraq, in Syria. But I believe we are all engaged in this. I mean, when you look to ISIS, why those people also coming from the West joining ISIS? If you consider that it's only about ideology, let me just disargue with you when you call it jihadist. Jihad in Islam, it's had another meaning. It has nothing to do.
Takfiri.
Yes, takfiri.
Oh, we're not going to have
they are not jihadists.
debate about
Yeah.
Islamic technology.
It's about takfiri. Those, and it's not only because they are coming from Middle East, because this phenomenon now, you are witnessing those people coming from a democratic, and if you can tell that people coming from Middle East, because there is no democracy, there is no freedom of expression. What makes those teenagers coming from Europe, coming from West countries, joining ISIS? Is it about because of the technology, or is it about people have no hope? And here I want to bring an example. I've heard it from a Belgian friend when she told me that her friend, she is native Belgium and Catholic, and she just disappeared. After 6 months, she got an SMS from her saying, well, I am with ISIS now. Yes, I've converted to Islam. I lost half of my freedom, but I got a job and I got an income. And you know, I'm having 2 master's degrees. I was not able to get any job for 2 years. So I have no choice, the only choice, I have to join ISIS. So the root causes, and now, if you look to Syria, the root causes of this terrorism is not only of those takfiris, it's because that regime was killing. He is killing more people than what ISIS is killing in Iraq and Syria both. So
Yes, which makes the point that sometimes states are more dangerous than terrorist groups in terms of looking at the totality of the threats.
Dramatically more.
Yeah.
Bashar al-Assad's regime has killed 9.5 times as many people as ISIS has killed.
Yes. Well, I'd like to come back in a minute, Al-Ketbi, because you raised a very important point there, that we are dealing with problems of income inequality, of deprivation, about a tremendous problem that social media gives people the illusion that they can have some kind of influence on the debate, that gives them access to information, they can see more clearly than ever what they're missing out on, and yet the economic reality is that their options are often very curtailed, which leads into this incredible sense of desperation and frustration. But we've talked a lot about terrorism and security threats and cyber threats. Just to get really depressed, what about, or scared, what about pandemics? I mean, are we actually missing the point? Should we be more concerned about pandemics and security problems? Because as you point out, Al-Ketbi, this is just one of a complex of issues which are very important.
I think we should definitely pay more attention to pandemics, and I think it's very fitting that we are including pandemics as a human security and global threat, and not just a public health issue. I was involved with work by the US National Academy of Medicine in supporting a commission to look independently at our global preparedness for pandemics, and the commission estimated that the economic costs of a pandemic is actually huge. And if you annualize it, it costs more than $60 billion a year. So pandemics, of course, cause a lot of suffering, morbidity, and deaths, but they also have a huge economic impact and impact on trade. I think besides the kind of electronic connectivity, the other important factor is just human mobility. Mm-hmm. And as we come back to the topic of global cities just have lots and lots of people from all around the world passing through them or visiting them. If you look at the case of Singapore, I Googled this yesterday, and so it must be true. It's Singapore.
You didn't check on the FT.com website? I mean, that is definitely true.
Singapore is only 10% larger than the size of Chicago. It has 5.5 million people, but every year, 15 million tourists visit. And every year, more than 55 million passengers transit through our airport. And they come from all parts of the world. And therefore, this massive human mobility creates the conditions where infections can spread from one part of the world to another. And if you link that to the fact that no part of the world is really remote today, things that happen in places that you have to look up the map on can easily spread to other places. In 2003, Singapore and several countries, Hong Kong and others, had to grapple with the epidemic of SARS. And that epidemic emanated from one ill person who went from southern China to Hong Kong, stayed in a hotel there, which has since changed its name, stayed in a hotel, passed infection to 12 people who went to 6 countries, and within more than 3 weeks had caused an outbreak involving 250 people, and eventually an outbreak involving many countries in the world with 8,000 patients. So they're just one person through the connectivity that we see. So there are very few places that are really remote today, and things that happen in one part of the world can quickly spread to other parts. And so for pandemics, as we see for terrorism and other things, we are all in the same boat. We might be living in different cabins, but we're all in the same boat. And each of us have to make sure that our part of the cabin is watertight, it's fit for purpose against turbulent seas. But we also can't ignore what's happening in other cabins, because if other cabins are leaking, if there are problems there, they will spread, they will influence what's happening in other parts of our world.
So do you think, I'm curious for each of you, do you think we're actually missing the point here in that it's very easy for the media, if in doubt, blame the media. It's very easy for the media to focus on ISIS or to focus on terrorism because it makes, good headlines and things. But do you think we're missing the point that actually the biggest danger or the bigger danger to global cities is actually pandemics rather than another ISIS attack?
I do, because it's easily can be transferred. I mean, maybe you can, security arrangement, maybe you can stop some of terrorist group or terrorist action. But as I said, biological threats, biological bomb, it can be used. So it's the problem is easily to be transferred to another cities, as he mentioned, how epidemic has.
Right. Paul or David?
Yeah, Gillian, what keeps me awake at night really is biopandemic and cyber Armageddon.
Biopandemic and cyber Armageddon.
Yeah, so I don't sleep
That
well.
makes James Bond sound possibly tame.
So you know, I think my colleague, clearly espoused the risks of the pandemic, and I certainly agree with that. He's much more knowledgeable than I, but we're so dependent upon technology, increasingly so. You made the point about self-driven cars. When that happens, really, really interesting things can occur. But just to take that, one step further, there was a study done, and I know you have an anthropological background, so you might find this interesting, that after 72 days or 72 hours of power out in a city, that's kind of the breaking point when anarchy ensues. So basically if somebody can actually damage or shut down the power grid and have it persist for a long period of time, that's when society starts to unravel. And that's just one example of malfeasance that can be attributed to cybersecurity.
Right.
I would say I think that convergence is a key theme here that we've been talking about, where it's when you start to get the convergence of cyber, terrorism, disease, sort of what you might describe as urban overstretch, all building up together. That's when you really start to get more extreme kinds of threats. On the other hand, I think we can think beyond the more classical prevention model to something that's more about resilience, which is a bit of a buzzword now on a bunch of different ideas with cities, but it's very applicable to this because take the example of terrorism just as one subset. But you could equally say this for health or for food security or cyber. It's not about preventing things from happening. We know they're going to happen. The chance of a terrorist attack in a major city is 100%. But it's how resilient are you to that shock when it happens? How quickly can you recover? How gracefully do systems degrade? How much redundancy is there? How much is the community able to put things back in place quickly while the state is still responding? All these things that's where a lot of the leading edge thinking in cities in particular is directed right now.
Well, that really brings me on to a very good point, because I don't want everyone to go away feeling completely depressed, or even more depressed than they were before. Because I'd actually like to switch the conversation and talk about what are the solutions to this. Because, as you say, simply saying we must live in a world where these threats never happen is just not realistic today. I'm curious to know in each of the different areas what can be actually done to contain it. And perhaps I can start with you, Dr. Tan, because on the issue of pandemics, I spent a bit of time last year talking to the World Bank about this. And the point they made is that, as you say, pandemics are a global issue. The contagion risk is enormous. And yet there isn't really any very effective international mechanism to finance preparation for pandemics or even to implement quickly the measures that are needed if they hit. I mean, would you agree? I mean, what do you think needs to be done? Yeah. If you were mayor of Chicago, what would you do? If you were president of the World Bank today, what would you do?
Yeah, I think, so firstly, I think on the perception side of the house, the problem with pandemics is they come, sometimes people think they're far away, they don't quite appreciate the scale of human mobility, and they don't think it's something that affects their own lives, and then they fade out of the news. Whereas, other types of news are pervasive, they keep on coming up, and so they heighten the sense of uncertainty and fear. But I think on the area of pandemics, there's a lot that can be done, both locally in each country, and I completely agree with the point about resilience, and that the preparation for pandemics in some ways are also applicable to preparation against other types of global threats that can affect the city. But at an international level, it starts, I think, from helping countries where the health systems are still in an early phase of development to strengthen their health systems. And that, in fact, this will create a bigger good in terms of uplifting the health and life expectancy of people in places which are less developed. And then, in addition, creating a much better response capacity that requires funding, requires expertise, requires equipment. But another very critical thing, I think, that came out of the recent Ebola outbreak was the really important need to build cultural understanding. Because it's not just about technology, it's not about flying in doctors, but how you actually work with the communities on practices that can actually propagate infections, such as burial practices, funeral practices, and so on. And that cultural sensitivity, coupled with the trust between communities, health authorities, and governments, I think that is the part that needs a great deal of work.
But who should be doing that? I mean, is that something you think the World Bank should be doing? Is that something which the World Health Organization? Is it up to national governments? Is it down to Bill Gates?
No, I think the impetus, I think, has to come from the local people, the local community. They must prioritize what is most important for them. But I think that the WHO, the UN, the World Bank, even IMF, have important roles to play in helping to shape that prioritization and in directing the resources to the places that we think would make most impact, both in terms of improving overall health delivery, but also in terms of strengthening health systems, and also creating a greater element of community trust.
I mean, the problem is that most of these organizations, for any of you who've dealt with them, are desperately bureaucratic and slow, and diseases spread at lightning speed. I mean, if I was mayor of a city, I wouldn't want to sit there and wait till the WHO got its act together and gave me, the necessary medicines. I mean, most people think, actually, we need to get moving and find ways to get around that.
Correct, and I think the engagement is to start in peacetime, right? You can't only just start when an outbreak is occurring, because everyone's so focused on that. And therefore, it requires a lot of preparation, it requires a lot of engagement, it requires a lot of trust building and a common understanding of what the key priorities are. In between pandemics, I think that's the best time to prepare for this.
Right, okay, so it doesn't matter what you do in wartime in medical terms, what you do in peacetime is the important thing, which is probably a good message for right now. What about cybersecurity, where in fact you've got a constant guerrilla war already going on? No, I mean, because as David said, we live in a world where basically there are going to be shocks. Can you build in resilience in the system?
Yeah, I think the broader theme of applying technology toward some of these issues, I think I see a lot of great things happening out there. I see increasingly cities and municipalities becoming more transparent, reaching to citizens, engaging them in the process of being safe, so that they're more active. I see open data policy starting to materialize, so that we can get people innovating around this prodigious amount of data that's being created. So I see a lot of really smart things being done by cities to engage the broader world in this problem. On cyber in particular, I mean, I completely agree with David. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and it's not a matter, it is absolutely not preventable. So there are a few strategies. National Institute of Standards and Technology published a cybersecurity framework, which is really a life cycle, starting with identify what's important and end with recover, and then deal with everything in between. So it's a matter of mitigation. I think scenario planning is very important, and you have to apply scenario planning across the board for cyber kinds of issues as well. Federal Emergency Management Agency regularly surveys U.S. cities about their preparedness for different kinds of threats and scenarios. And for the last 4 years running, cybersecurity is ranked at the bottom of the list in terms of their preparedness for that. So we have
what cities at least, does it rank cities according to how prepared they are?
No. They just ask each city. It gives each city, here's a list of threats. Tell me which one you're least prepared for.
It doesn't tell you the top of the class, bottom of the class, the riskiest cities to live in America.
No. That's the median you're kicking in, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. That would make it readable. I guarantee you, if you gave that ranking, every single person in the audience wouldn't be listening to this. They'll be looking on their cell phones to see how Chicago ranked or anywhere else.
So the last point I'd make is it's a multifaceted or a layered approach. So maybe the best example I can give for that is you can certainly have the broader surface area that provides all of the wonderful technologies that we increasingly depend upon for an engaging city and a vibrant community. But when those things are inevitably compromised, you have to have something you can fall back to. So an example of that was when the Boston Marathon bombing happened a few years ago. Police Commissioner Davis was telling me that in the multi-block radius of where that happened, nothing worked. Cell phones couldn't send a text, couldn't make a phone call, couldn't move one bit of data. But what did work? It was their Motorola Solutions land mobile radio system.
Okay, you're not allowed to turn this into an official corporate marketing exercise.
But the point I'm making is that was something that was engineered specifically with thought in mind for handling those kinds of scenarios.
But is the issue, apart from the fact that obviously Motorola did work there, so congratulations on that, but is the point that actually, in some ways, people who've been designing cities have been getting it wrong in that it's all been about streamlining and efficiency and hyperconnectivity and hyperspeed. And actually, if you listen to people like Nassim Taleb, you know, the man who wrote about the Black Swan, what we really need to be looking for these days is resilience in the form of actually not having too much connectivity. Actually, in the cybersecurity world, I was talking to some utility operators in America recently about cyber threats, and what they were trying to tell me to reassure me was actually their system wasn't hyperconnected. It could break down into little pieces very fast, and that would contain the threat. And that whole concept of actually creating breakpoints, slowing things down, actually having, if you like, a multiplicity of channels to communicate with, rather than just being too efficient all the time, is that what we should be standing up and talking about to create resilience?
Yeah, right. Well,
You all want to talk, great.
Let somebody else have a go.
Yeah.
well, I think that's a very good point that, in the past we designed for convenience, then we designed for environmental sustainability, we design cities now for better health, but we also have to design it for greater resilience. And just speaking about infection control, for example, after the SARS outbreak, all of us learned that we had designed it so that our hospitals are so porous that each person comes into contact with so many other people throughout the hospital system. And what happens is that hospitals inadvertently become amplifiers of infection, as opposed to being places where people are protected. Right. And it required a complete rethink about the way we organize how people flow, how we separate potentially infectious people from non-infectious people, how we, even the toilets, how we design them and so on and so forth, the way the health professionals treated infection control. Right. And to do this in a way that allowed the hospital operations, the clinical operations to proceed without undue inconvenience. It can be done, but it requires a lot of forethought, redesign of facilities as well as of processes.
So we need to stand up and say, actually, we're going to celebrate inefficiency and inconvenience. What does that mean for cybersecurity? And I want to ask you and then turn to Dr. Al-Ketbi.
So I think containerization is a strategy and air gapping is a strategy. But
Did I say that again? So the audience, gapping.
Air gapping.
Air gapping.
It's
Okay.
basically
Air
puts-
gapping sounds fantastically 20th century when you start talking about cyber links. But
I do like James Bond, so I'm glad we're
Okay.
making that connection.
so what does air gapping mean?
Air
to the
gapping just
audience?
basically means what you said earlier. I place space, literally I don't connect one thing to another thing. So literally it's a physical security mechanism. But even then, there are still measures we have to think about. There's the insider threat problem. So a bad person who's been compromised inside of what is thought to be a secure physical world, or somebody that accidentally walks in and sticks a memory stick into the wrong place at the wrong time. So containerization is very important, but really what you're building on is the idea I mentioned earlier, which is this notion of layering.
Right.
So certainly the broad surface area, the convenience part, as you talked about earlier, that's the part that gets the most surface area, probably the most suspect. But you have to be able to devolve to layers that are actually having increased degrees of resilience as you go.
Right. So containerization, air gapping, layerization.
Layerization. Yeah.
Layerization, that's hard to pronounce, and inconvenience. Some of those are the key elements of resilience. David, what do you make of that? I mean, can you use any of that to fight back against ISIS?
Well, I think I want to go back to what I said at the beginning about all hazards, right? I mean, I think you want to think about all the things that can affect a city and you want to plan for that rather than optimizing for one threat, which in fact may be very emotionally searing, but it's not actually the most common or the most significant. And I would point to a number of things. One is having decentralized, renewable electrical and water systems, right? So a classical city has one big water purification and distribution system and big power stations, and if the power station goes out, 500,000 people don't have power. And actually 72 hours is the longest that it takes for civil order to break down in a grid down scenario. So it could be much quicker.
Yeah, in my house it takes about 2 hours.
Yeah, right. So if everybody has
Is
small...
that based on any sort of tangible historical evidence?
It's modeling. It's what's called metabolic systems modeling of cities. You can geek out on it later, but basically the just-in-time logistics systems have become so efficient that when you break the system, it only takes a very short period of time for that to wash through and have a major effect. But if you make, like, let's say everyone has their own photovoltaic system that, solar cells that charges their key devices and aren't reliant on the centralized grid, that significantly raises you like an order of magnitude in terms of resilience. Another one is redundant communications, right? So cell phones always go out in the event of terrorist attacks. This is a common feature. Either the system itself is compromised or everybody jumps on and tries to text and call each other and it's just swamped. There are new devices, and I have no connection with this company, but if you have a kid in middle school, they probably know about this app called JOTT, J-O-T-T, which is Bluetooth mesh networking to pass messages not using the cell phone system or using any kind of internet data. And that stays working, even if, as long as you have a device, it stays working even when the grid goes down. Another thing I think it's worth thinking about is community-based security. In most of the world, more cops in your district just means more opportunities to get shaken down. It doesn't make you any safer. Chicago might be an exception to that, but most of the rest of the world, it's not. So community-based security, where the focus is on community cohesion, having a community security shura or a community network that shares information and lets people tap into an understanding of what's going on and pool resources. That's not so much important just in the crisis. It's important pre-crisis for building the relationships that help you cope. And then the final thing I'd say is what I might call building in predictable breakpoints to the system. So the most effective and popular tactical drone that's used by special forces now in the counterterrorism world is actually held together by magnets, right? And whenever it crashes, magnets, yeah. Whenever it crashes, it breaks in 5 places because it's held together with magnets. If you try to make the whole thing completely unbreakable, it is going to break, but you just don't know where. When you build in predicted breakpoints, it just pops apart when it hits the ground, you just assemble it again and you fly it. And I think you can take that same idea and apply it on a bigger scale to everything from factories to cities to companies.
That's fascinating. I can see a title of a new book, Cities Built of Magnets.
Actually, the best guy to read on this is actually Nasser Nicholas Taleb, who you quoted earlier. His latest work is on this stuff called anti-fragility.
Yes.
Right? The idea that threats will actually make your system stronger over time.
That's fascinating. Well, Dr. Al-Ketbi, I'm very curious on your perspective on this because, you know, many Middle Eastern cities are already imbued with a sense of community, of local groups. They're not hyper-efficient. Do you think that the Middle East has something to teach the Western world about resilience?
Well, let me take it to a global level. In terms of you want to counter these transnational threats, I think we need to form a transnational consortium with a representative from global cities and relevant national agencies that could network together and organize a systematic international response. So the need for global radicalization consortium, it's a must now, because no cities, no one agency can counter any those transnational threats alone. So here, neither Middle East nor those in the States or in Europe or in Asia, if we did not cooperate on an international level, also engaging the international agencies, we will not be able to counter these threats. Now, in terms of resilience, well, I say Middle East is weaker. But let me take the Gulf cities, and mainly I'm talking because I'm coming from UAE, Abu Dhabi and Dubai. It's very strong, rather than other
So strong cities, weaker state or weaker regions.
Yeah, and especially after if you can call it the Arab Spring, those cities like Cairo, like Tripoli, is vulnerable to this kind of threats. And now you cannot separate cyber threats or epidemic or terrorists, because it's all, it can be, I mean, these radical groups can use the cyber, can use the biological, can use the weapon. So it's all related together if you can relate it to terrorist attack. So that's why nobody, and it's not only the cities whom they are facing the threats, and the rural areas and with urban areas, everybody is facing that kind of threats.
Well, I'm going to turn to the audience in a moment and ask for some questions. Before I do, though, I'd just like to ask each of you, if you had some advice for anyone in the room right now who's feeling nervous, other than go and find your cave, is there anything that we as individuals can do to make ourselves safer in our cities? I mean, how much is this about the government? How much is it about what we personally can do? I mean, other than grab a teenager and ask them to tell us about these 50 new ways to communicate that we don't yet know about. What would you do? Yes.
You know, I think it's manage your information very carefully and take prudent control of your identity in a cyber setting. Always be aware of your surroundings. Don't put yourself in risk. I mean, one of the virtues of what the media does for us is it communicates a lot. So we have no reason not to be informed of almost everything that happens in real time.
Okay, so read newspapers. Is that your message? I can totally support that one.
Trying to help you out. But I guess my point is, I think there's pretty well established things that we as individuals can do to not put ourselves in situations where we don't really need to. I was mentioning before, there's a book, and I have no affiliation with the author, but it's a great read. It's called Future Crimes by a gentleman by the name of Mark Goodman. And after you read that, you'll know about pretty much every threat that could come to us as civilians. So read that and be aware.
Right.
I think one of the reasons why people really fear the unknown is if they don't really know what they can do themselves to protect. So if you look at SARS, it affected 8,000 patients. I mean, that in the scheme of things is not a very large number of patients. But the amount of fear, the anxiety, it was tremendous. I mean, the point of hysteria. And part of the reason is it was a completely new virus. Very little was known about it right at the beginning. People didn't know how it's transmitted, how to protect themselves. It seemed to be random. You know, you could be doing something very ordinary, like take a taxi, and you could get up infected. And that is the kind of thing that really freaks people out. And so I would say that as we try to communicate risks, as and it's very important to try to explain what individuals can do to protect themselves. During epidemic, we'll say, well, if you're ill, don't go to work. Because if you went to work, if everybody, Singaporeans, always go to work, right, even though they're sick. And that's not a good thing, because everybody else will get very freaked out if you went there wearing a mask and so on. And if you had people whom you think were ill, wash your hands, avoid crowded places, etc., etc. I mean, simple, commonsensical things, but it's very important for individuals to understand what they could do themselves to reduce their own personal risks.
Right, so basically, don't just read the newspapers, heed the health advice.
Yeah.
Al-Ketbi, what would you suggest?
I never feel fear of anything. I don't take it.
Well, that's a sign of a resilient spirit.
Let me give you an example. Where coming to Chicago, it was only about 5 minutes when we landed on the ground before the storm started, rain started. It's just about 5 minutes. If we were still on the sky, we couldn't make it, and it was really shaky. So it's about only sometimes. This is my belief. Sometimes luck play a great role, and this is I've experienced in my life. Right. Many things. So whatever you will take, but this does not mean, for the cities, no, they have to take. One thing I did not mention, that cities have to develop what they call it prediction model and risk assessment and analysis based on the new type of threats is coming. So right. This is, in terms of resilience, this has to be developed on the level of cities.
So use big data at a city level and have a positive attitude on an individual level.
Yes.
David?
Well, I already gave some practical ideas, and I agree with what everybody else has said. I guess my only sort of more philosophical comment would be, with specific reference to terrorism, there are two ideas that a lot of people have which I think are really dangerous and can make you much more anxious than you need to be. One of them is the idea that there's this constant very high-level terrorist threat that's out there and the terrorists are trying to get us all the time. It's actually much more random than that. The threat's a lot lower than people think, and I think
What is the probability of being hit by a terrorist attack?
well, I don't know the number, but it's substantially lower than being struck by lightning.
So you're more likely to be hit by lightning than
Orders of magnitude more likely, yes.
than to be involved in a terrorist attack.
But the other thing is the idea, which I think people have to free themselves from, which is the idea that the government can somehow protect you, right? There isn't the terrorist threat that people think there is. You could give all your freedom to the government. It's not going to make any difference, very little difference. So I think you just have to free yourself from that expectation, get on with your life, learn about the threats, as Paul said, understand the protocols, and just get on with it. And I think that fundamental attitude underlies all this resilience stuff that we've been talking about.
And just very quickly before I turn to the audience, and I will do now, but very quickly, do any of you have a city that you admire in terms of its attempt to deal with security threats?
Dubai.
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 Okay. Maybe
I always feel safe.
Dubai safe, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're all going to be parochial here, but I think Sydney is an interesting one.
Okay, so Sydney, Dubai.
Singapore
Someone in the audience should put their hand up and say Chicago at this point, but anyway.
Singapore is clinical and safe.
Okay.
And I agree with all of them.
Okay. Well, because you have clients in all three cities.
Do.
Okay, any of you got a city that you think has a lot to learn about security threats? Which are the dangerous cities that you would not want to go to right now?
Not Baghdad, of course.
Not Baghdad.
I think maybe you posed a little bit of a philosophical an answer to your question, but I think they can all learn a lot from each other, to be honest with you. I think each faces some unique conditions and circumstances. And I think dealing with these threats, whether it's cyber, pandemic, or whether it's terrorism, it's a scale game. So the cities together are smarter than they are as individuals.
Right, which of course is one of the points of this forum, is getting people together to actually exchange ideas and try and, if not give mutual praise, then at least try to swap some thoughts and learning experiences. Anyone got any questions? Anyone like to stand up and tell us why Chicago is dead safe? Got a couple of questions in the audience. As ever, it would be courteous, but not compulsory, to identify yourself. Please keep your comments or questions very short. And if you want to direct it to someone in particular, please do. And we're also getting some questions in from Twitter as well.
Hi, Margot Pritzker, Chicago Council and Chicago Urban Labs. You've alluded to it, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about infrastructure. The FT did a long article several weeks ago about the decaying nature of infrastructure in the US. And it's one of the things that terrifies me because it seems to provide great opportunities for terrorism. So I'd just like to hear your comments. You talked about technology, a little bit about power stations, water systems.
Who would like to talk about infrastructure? David, Paul?
Happy to, but I think it's more in your area.
Yeah. So I think with decaying infrastructure, I think there's an opportunity there as well, for sure. That's an opportunity to uplift and upgrade and to replace, the pieces that need to be replaced with technology in a prudent manner. So certainly there is threat there, but I think what we're seeing, and this back to my comment earlier from learning across the world, some of the best practices aren't necessarily in the cities that we're in right now. Some of those can be learned from abroad as well. So I think with that dilemma is an opportunity if executed upon properly.
Well, I think there's also an additional item, which is, right now we are introducing technology very rapidly, and quite often without fully understanding the risks, the kind of unintended side effects and so on. And I think that it would also be good as we deploy technology to try to find ways to better understand the human factor issues, the impact on communities, and how, in fact, we could take mitigating steps ahead of time.
Well, that sounds like a call to hire lots of anthropologists, which I also support as an idea.
Well, it's an interesting point, though. That's one of the shifts we made at Motorola Solutions in designing our products, is we brought in a large number of user experience design folks, which are fundamentally ethnographic researchers or anthropological backgrounds. So it's really about the human point of this and trying to understand how the technology should apply to them.
Yes, I'm often, as someone who has a background in anthropology, I'm often asked by anxious parents if their kids who are studying it will ever find jobs. And the good news is that actually they will do these days because they're trying to understand the implications of technology. It's a real change. We've got another question just over there and then over there.
Mark Anderson, I'm a journalist. My question is directed to David. You're talking about resiliency. Should cities loosen zoning laws so more people can grow gardens, become involved in local agriculture? You had Detroit rebuild itself from all that economic decay by having community gardens. It brought people together. In other words, borrowing a page from the Amish is not self-sufficiency, an inroad to resiliency.
Well, thanks, Mark. That's a great point. I mean, I think that absolutely self-sufficiency is a way to begin thinking about resiliency. Obviously, you have to balance public health codes with, you know, zoning requirements and so on. And there's a sort of bottom-up or middle-out urban planning factor here in terms of how you design that in a way that makes sense. But to the extent that you can get people involved in those projects in a way that builds community, I think that's fundamental. I wrote a book on cities a couple of years ago, and I actually, at the end of the book, I quote from this classic 1961 movie called The Bridge on the River Kwai. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that, where you've got a sort of battalion of British prisoners locked up by the Japanese, and they're building this bridge, and one of the officers says to the CEO, "Why are we doing this? Why are we building the Japanese this wonderful bridge?" And he says, and I'm paraphrased, he says, "You don't get it, right? We're not building a bridge. We're rebuilding the battalion. We're rebuilding the community by means of this bridge. And if we didn't have this project to hand, we'd have to make something up, right?" And I think that's a way to think about it, right? You use these kind of infrastructure projects, and to Margot's comment earlier too, the sort of decentralized ways of thinking about infrastructure as a way of building community resiliency. What you're building is the community. The infrastructure is just kind of the way to get to that.
But there is another question there, which is whether we do live in a world which is so hyper-streamlined and so technology-obsessed that we're not teaching our kids enough basic resilient skills. I mean, I spent years of my life in the former Soviet Union, and I was always very struck that whenever things happened, which would be disastrous in the Western world, the families I knew were incredibly resilient because they all had these, you know, kitchen plots. They were all used to bottling and pickling everything. They all had these networks, and they were very experienced in survival because of things like gardens.
I knew a girl in Beirut once who, whenever there was a shot fight in the street outside, would immediately fill the bath with water. Well, right? Because she knew as soon as there's violence in the street, water's going to go out, right? I mean, it's what you're used to. It's how you grow up. Yeah.
Yes. It's a great reason why we have grandparents, to teach kids how to remember the world before we had iPhones. Got a question back there. I've got lots of questions coming through. One there, and then I'll turn to the Twitter question in a minute. Lady with her hand up, and then we'll come over here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Alyssa Ayers. I'm from the Council on Foreign Relations. I think this discussion has brought out even more dramatically the question that you asked last night, Gillian, which was, should cities have a foreign policy? So I wonder what some of the panelists would answer to the question of how should national governments, which is where our foreign policies reside, how should national governments be thinking about that outreach to cities across the world? Because these are shared issues of threat that require global coordination.
Well, since none of you are actually running a city, would any of you like to say who should have authority for foreign policy?
I think,
Al-Ketbi.
I mean, sometimes the city's interest has a constraint on the state foreign policy, and vice versa. Sometimes the economic needs of cities, putting a constraint on the foreign policy in terms of migration, that you have to open doors for immigrants. Sometimes this is, I mean, let me take UAE as an example. Maybe the state doesn't want to bring more immigrants in the country because the indigenous are minority, while Dubai as a city should be open the doors for the immigrants. And now, to balance between both interests, the state interest, and this is how they are both trying to balance that.
Right.
So I think that the foreign policy should be the state policy.
Well, I think it's quite interesting because on the one hand, you need a lot more coordination to be really prepared and be able to respond well. Who collects information, who analyzes it, the relative roles of a national versus a state or city government, because quite often we see, in fact, a lot of dysfunction occurring because of lack of coordination, lack of sharing information, and in fact, the final outcome is much worse. And therefore, there is a case actually for much better integration and a better coordination. But I think there's also a role really for kind of cross-country dialogue, preparation, both at a formal level, but also at informal level. And I think the informal level often is not as much emphasized, but particularly at a sort of operating unit level, informal links with other cities, other countries that are dealing with the same problem, actually very, very useful in obtaining sources of information, advice that actually help local operators to deal with problems.
Right. We've got a question down there that I kept cutting off. Apologies.
Thank you.
And then we'll do the Twitter question.
Thank you so much. My name is Perla Hernandez-Trumco. I work with U.S. Congresswoman Grace Napolitano in Southern California. We have a collaborative of cities that are they're called the Council of Governments. Many of these cities have begun to put cameras in their communities, cameras for regular crime, but most of the mayors and councils have decided that they're also very interested in looking at potential threats, and they've mentioned the word terrorism over and over. Media has a lot to do with that hype, and the concern is, and my question is, how do we balance the protection of citizens, residents, immigrants, community, and that of protecting also from terrorism or any activities such as terrorism, crimes, et cetera? We've crossed the line, and we are having Big Brother look at us at all times. And that is a question I'm bringing to the front, because where is our privacy? And I know that's a full session there altogether.
So do any of you think that Big Brother has gone too far?
So Gillian, you used the example earlier of growing up in London. Partly as a result of that extended terrorism threat in London in the 1980s and 1990s, London today is the most heavily instrumented piece of urban terrain on the planet. You get off the plane in Heathrow, you'll be on close-circuit camera all the way into central London and throughout your movement. It doesn't necessarily prevent terrorism, right? And it comes down to a very stark choice. How many terrorist attacks are we prepared to accept in major cities as the price of being free of this surveillance? If it was up to me, that number's not zero. I think that our privacy and our freedom is much too important to be just surrendering to the idea that the government's going to keep you safe, because frankly, they're not. It doesn't work like that. But that has to be a public debate, and specifically people like me, counterterrorism professionals, shouldn't be allowed to drive that debate, right? Because there's too much at stake in terms of, contracts and people's work and gear that gets, the camera manufacturers, right, that sell cameras to cities make millions of dollars off this kind of surveillance technology. So it has to be a public discussion about how much are we prepared to surrender of our freedom and independence in return for increased security. And I think part of the challenge now is educating the public on what the issues are so that we can actually have that debate. I was struck by the response to the San Bernardino shooting and the iPhone decoding issue that came after that. And that really sharpened that discussion, particularly in California, about what, but it also brought out the fact that there are people that have very different points of view on this. And I think we really need to be engaging in a structured debate about it.
But that's pretty striking. I mean, turkeys don't often vote for Christmas, and to have a counter-terrorism official saying that there may be too much surveillance is unusual.
Yeah, but you just have to look at the data, right? I mean,
I'm curious. If I look at the audience right now, how many of you in the room think that in the West there is too much surveillance now, given the level of risks? Okay, and how many of you think there should be more? Okay, well, a slight majority of the room agrees with you.
Let me give you a technical comment, right?
Those of you who couldn't see, I'd say about 60% said there's too much, and about 20 to 30% said there should be more. and 10% of you are either asleep or pretty happy right now.
The purpose of wide area surveillance, right, and this term surveillance is scary, right, but all it is the structured observation of a large area, right, to detect change. That's all it is, right? So whether it's electronic or some other method, the purpose of it is to identify behaviors ahead of time that allow you to respond and prevent an attack. The more connectivity increases and the more ad hoc terrorism becomes, and the more it becomes a kid who wakes up one morning and decides to do an attack with no group associated with it and no plot, the less important, the less useful that wide area surveillance becomes. And it becomes a tax imposition on businesses and on the community. It becomes a drag on people's freedom, but it doesn't necessarily give you any more safety.
So it's not just a civil rights issue, it's actually about decreasing efficacy, effectively.
From my standpoint, it is fundamentally a civil rights issue, right? You run the risk of destroying the society that you're trying to save by putting in place things that just make it no longer the country that we've grown up in, right? But it is also an issue of efficacy, yeah.
Paul, would you agree, since you're in the business of selling us all better,
I knew you were going to do
technology
that.
systems? Well, you've already given us a corporate plug for Motorola's fantastic communication systems in a crisis. So now you can tell us whether there are too many of these out in the world.
So I think it's going to sound obvious and hopefully not condescending, but I think there's that balance of if people perceive benefit, then they're absolutely tolerant of it. So I think that point that you made earlier, I think, David, about a public debate, I think you have to let society kind of speak. I think the other point that both David and I think Dr. Tan made as well, is that I think an increasingly more effective way, or what people are starting to experiment with, is societal engagement. You know, reaching to society, letting them opt in and participate, because when you have all of society participating, then you essentially get everybody, you know, playing a role in keeping the city safe.
So one question I had is, as you say, the threats are becoming more decentralized, but is there still a role for more risk-based kind of surveillance, where you intensify your surveillance around targets you think are particularly valuable?
Yeah, I mean, I was responding, I'm sorry, I forgot your first name. Perla, sorry, Perla. I mean, I was responding to Perla's specific question about wide area surveillance in cities. I think there's absolutely a case for targeted monitoring of critical sites. And that might be cameras, but it might also be like monitoring of like electrical current moving through certain key parts of your infrastructure. I mean, there's all sorts of things, you know, that you can do. And, you know, the World Health Organization published a paper last year, as I'm sure you're aware, talking about how the traditional model of surveillance and containment doesn't work anymore for pandemics, right? So that suggests that there is a need for sort of more targeted monitoring. But again, I would go back to my other point, which is how much freedom are you prepared to submit in order to get how much benefit back? And this is Paul's point. And we have to educate people on what the issues are. And then, frankly, people like us who do this for a living need to step back and let the community decide. And then we can make it work either way, to be honest.
Right.
I have one more comment.
Sorry?
Add a comment.
Yeah, absolutely, please do. Yes, I should quickly say, by the way, that we are going to go on next for a few minutes because we started late. So we'll take one more comment, one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
Just back on the notion of inclusion, I was in Canada a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that's being talked about a lot now is predictive policing, you know, trying to anticipate where resources should be deployed because they're very finite. And the usual way that that's done, or conventional wisdom, is you look at past indicators and what's happened in the past, you correlate that with other things like weather and other factors, and try to make a determination. What Canada's doing is, apparently in their census, they ask people, do you feel safe where you live? And basically what they're finding is that is a very good predictor and indicator of where, when people say they don't feel safe, that's where they're starting to bias their resource deployment to. And they're actually changing public sentiment in the engagement process. So very interesting ways to think about how public safety and society can interact.
Right. I'm going to just turn to the last question, which is from Twitter, from Gudinas M, saying, what is the role of propaganda for growing level of global threats? Is there any way to address that? That's a question which could be also rephrased as, is it all the media's fault? You know, do we need more information, less information? Is it because basically a misinformation is at work in terms of stoking up these threats?
The right information.
What?
And media are always hurry and wants to grab the first information. And And sometimes this kind of information cannot be publicized by the government until, look to the example of the Egyptian aircraft that the government did not get. Until now, they are denying that it is something wrong with the aircraft and it is a terrorist attack. And until now, we don't know if it's a terrorist attack or not. But media, from the beginning, they start that this is a terrorist attack. Until now, we are not sure it is a terrorist attack and who is attacking this aircraft. So sometimes media just grab the first information rather than try to check if it's right or not. And from the other side, that also the authorities is not giving the exact information.
I would sort of turn this question the other way and say, how are people consuming information or misinformation? And one of the things I worry about are whether people are reading the things that they already believe in, and that you have a self-affirming type of behavior that eventually leads to polarization. And so if that becomes more pervasive, then it means really people are shutting their minds off to alternate views, including the true views of a situation. And I think a lot needs to be done in the community to try to bridge these potential types of behaviors, and also that those who are responsible, say, in delivering safe health services, resilience, and so on, have to really up our game in terms of how we can better reach out and engage with the community, and so try to provide a trusted and hopefully authoritative source of information. I think that would be really critical.
I would distinguish broadcast media from social media in this respect, right? So if we compare Al-Qaeda foreign fighters 15 years ago to ISIS foreign fighters today, there's a number of things that jump out in the differences of profile. Firstly, there's many more. There's 10 to 12 times as many ISIS foreign fighters as there were for Al-Qaeda. Secondly, proportionally, twice as many women compared to Al-Qaeda. Thirdly, it's a much younger group, sort of 11 years old to about 17 or 18 years old. That's maybe 10 years younger than what we saw with Al-Qaeda fighters. The biggest difference is active social media profile. And I actually think that you can explain those first three factors by the fact that people are on social media and it has a self-reinforcing effect and allows you to be anonymous and to sort of build ad hoc networks that can actually be quite strong in radicalizing people. So I think broadcast media is one issue, and we've talked about that, but I think the other one that's sort of relatively new is social media.
Paul, do you have any comment on what the media should or should not be doing?
No, I think
propaganda.
I think I'm pretty much. You have to kind of curate your source, and I think the broadcast media is typically a lot more responsible. And if you just pick up whatever happens to be blown through in social media as well, so
right.
You have to think about what you're reading and the veracity of the reporting.
Right. Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating discussion. I find it absolutely fascinating, not only because it's shown that in fact many of the threats that people would normally think about as the biggest threats, which is basically ISIS these days, are not necessarily the biggest ones at all. I mean, pandemics, infrastructure, other issues, homegrown terrorism, I think is something which we simply haven't focused enough on, but I find that fascinating. But I think the other thing I find absolutely fascinating is that we really do need to shift the debate towards an issue of resilience. And in an era where we're all essentially taught to worship efficiency, speed, connectivity at almost all costs, maybe we all need to be standing up and saying we should be embracing anti-efficiency, slowing things down, trying to create what I think you called air pockets, air gaps, layerization, containerization, a lot of izations, but in a sense, trying to, if you like, go back to basics and find ways to build more resiliency. And I think that's something which is a very powerful message, both for city governments and people leading cities, but probably each of us as well. So thank you for turning what could have been a fantastically depressing debate into something more optimistic. I don't think we need to go back to our caves quite yet. But in the meantime, I wish you all the best of luck and stay safe.
Thank you.
This concludes our morning sessions. At this time, we invite you to join us for lunch at Terzo Piano, upstairs on the third floor of the modern wing. As you exit the auditorium, our staff will be there.